Well, hi everyone. Here we are for parts 13 and 14, rewriting history. Well, not rewriting biblical history, but rewriting maybe the popular history you were taught that you think is fact. We call it the new history. And with me is Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. He's going to be the one doing the presentation. And Nathaniel, as we get underway here, in part 13, the neglected pre-Columbian history of the Americas. The pre-Columbian history of the Americas has remained one of the most mysterious eras of human story. Written records are absent, leaving genetics and archaeology to fill in the blanks. Or so we've been taught. Have written clues to the Americas been lying before our eyes this whole time? Oh, that's interesting. Join us as we uncover the neglected pre-Columbian history of the Americas. That sounds really interesting. And part 14, well, we'll talk more about that tomorrow when we get to part 14. But what happened to the Mayans? I've always wanted to know that. And I'm very interested in what you say is right there before our very eyes and we don't even realize it maybe. So Dr. Jeanson, just before we get into part 13, I read the comments that are posted every time you speak. And, a lot of people are very appreciative of this. And for a lot of people, it's so radical and yet they're prepared to have their thinking challenged. But there was someone who actually posted last week the comment that you say there were 54 million people in the Americas. That's impossible. That's ridiculous. Could you just speak to that first and then go on with part 13?
Yes, it's a good question, and it reflects just how radical a change mainstream archaeology of all places is affecting in our thinking. So my first response is to ask the person, why do they think that's impossible or unbelievable? And I should clarify, because I realized in my diagrams I'm putting it superimposing on Central America. That number isn't Central America is 53 million people. That means the entire Americas, just to make sure that the comment isn't something that's been miscommunicated on my part. So it's 53 million people for the entire Americas. And what comes to mind is why I think that's reasonable. It's highly debated even within the mainstream community. We looked at the ranges, but why I think it's very reasonable. Let's just think of the numbers for the rest of the world. We discussed in previous episodes, from episode 1 onward, there's been a massive change in the global human population in the last 600 years or so. After the Black Death finishes in Europe, 1400, we've undergone a 20-fold change in world population size from then till now. Well, in the Americas today, there's 300 some million people in the US. In Latin America, there's around 600 million. There's about 1 billion people today in the Americas, close to it. If there were 53 million people in 1491, it's just under a 20-fold change from then till now. So it's right in the ballpark of world population growth changes for the rest of the continents, the rest of the globe. That to me is reasonable. Plus there's increasing archaeological evidence that seems to keep pushing that number upward. We'll talk about it more in part 14, even for the area where the Mayans ruled, how research even within the last 2 years is rewriting and pushing up the number of people we thought were there. It's a massive number of people who lived here, far more civilization than we first thought. It's been obscured because the jungle has swallowed up so much of this, and the research is ongoing. But that's what comes to mind for me first is, it's a number for the entire Americas, not just Central America, this 53 million. It's a number that has some play in it. It's still being debated. The best evidence is archaeological. Some of the debate is because people are trying to take these death rates and then extrapolate backwards, and these have fairly large uncertainties and so forth. But the evidence to me is increasing from archaeology that this is quite reasonable, and it fits sort of these numbers that we have from around the globe. And we'll talk more about that specifically with the Mayans and some recent radar research that's being done in part 14 that I think is really fascinating. And there's places people can look into that further. What I want to do in this episode, though, is talk about a line of evidence and discuss some of the answers to the questions we raised previously that has the potential to be even more explosive on this question of the pre-Columbian Americas. And this question, of course, is one part of the larger question of who do we come from as the human race? We as peoples, even though we look different, talk different, act different, different cultures, all have a common ancestor. Even for creationists, though, I think we tend to think, well, that's still distant past, even if it's a few thousand years ago. We look at people that are different from us and maybe scratch our heads and say, well, I'm not quite sure how that works, but at some point it happened, and we don't pay much attention to it. And an example of that is a stereotype I've had for many years. My mother is German. My dad has been in America for several generations. So I trace my heritage essentially to Europe and have naturally assumed that's probably all it's ever been. And so these ancient cultures that we talk about in other parts of the globe that are not necessarily European or Western European, like the Greeks, or the Asian cultures like the Persians and Babylonians, or African ones like the Egyptians, well, that's not geographically where I'm from, and so they must not have any relationship really to my family tree. If it is, it's not even worth mentioning. Well, I've discovered that this sort of assumption that I'm sure many people hold is wrong. So, for example, I was just watching something with my wife the other day about ancient Egypt and modern Egyptians doing some of the archaeological work. They claim the ancient Egyptians as their heritage. Well, are they really their descendants? Who is related to these people? These are the questions we're going to be addressing in our series and have been addressing. I've made some promises early on of some of the big picture conclusions we're going to reach that rewrite the stereotypes we've had about who we are and who we've come from. I've said that we're eventually going to discover that so-called black-white people exist, that there are Caucasians running around who, going back just a few hundred years, have had African, dark-skinned people as their ancestors for thousands of years prior to that. I've promised, and we've seen in previous episodes, that we'll see that most Europeans are of recent Asian ancestry. And we've seen that about 2/3 of Western and Eastern Europe have recent Central Asian ancestry. You can see previous episodes for that. We've also seen that these European nationalities that I recognize people are rightly proud of, especially when it comes to sports and such things, these nationalities, German, French, Spanish, Italian, these disappear within a few hundred years in the human family tree. And I'll talk more about the specific family tree that we're talking about, the genetic basis for it. We saw last episode the genetic evidence that the Americas were resettled before Columbus, at least once. And we're still eventually going to get back to the earliest history and talk about Neanderthals and how they weren't primitive, but survivors of one or more ancient catastrophes. And my goal in all this is multifold. If you're a creationist watching it, that it would strengthen your faith, it would equip you to defend the faith apologetically. If you're not a creationist, that it would challenge what you've taken for granted and cause you to rethink. But for everyone, my ultimate goal is that we'd all be able to marvel at the story of who we are, who we came from, not just us personally, but those we love and their stories, who they've come from, and that we do so and we've never dreamed of marveling before. These are conclusions you'll find only here, things I wouldn't have dreamed of 5-10 years ago, but that recent genetic research is uncovering. So who are the Native Americans? We saw last time several shocking things that genetics has recently revealed, and this comes from a paper that was just published April of 2020, work I've been doing in collaboration with others. We've seen that the Native Americans today are not the first Americans. They arrived in the early AD era, somewhere between 250 AD and maybe 800 AD, from Central Asia. They came over, either mixed or perhaps wiped out whoever was here first. And this shock raises all sorts of other questions that we're now trying to uncover the answers to. Why did they leave Central Asia? What pushed them out? Why would they leave their homelands, make the dangerous trek across the Bering Strait to a land that's foreign, and engage people and overtake them? What did they do once they arrived here? What's their story besides just they came here and the rest is history? And of course, it raises the question of who were the people who were here first? Who did they come from? What's their story? Now, for years, people have approached this question ignoring a source, namely the Native Americans themselves. For example, the Delaware Indians, or the Lenape, when Europeans arrived, were on the Atlantic coast of New Jersey, New York, Delaware, and so forth. They have, or at least it's been claimed that they have a written record called the Red Record, or the Wallam Olam. The translation of it, this is the book we have in our library by David McCutcheon. We'll talk more about it shortly. Records like these, oral histories of Native Americans, have traditionally been discounted as mythological. And if you've ever read some of the Native Americans' own accounts for their history, just out of curiosity's sake, or perhaps part of school, you've probably been struck by some of the fantastical, often supernatural, seemingly mythological elements of these accounts that seem like they have little potential to contribute to understanding of their pre-Columbian history. This particular account, this was published in 1993, the translation, was the subject of a PhD thesis in anthropology at Rutgers University. David O. Stryker wrote his thesis arguing that this red record, the Wallam Olam of the Delaware Indians, is indeed a hoax. And that Rafinesque is the guy in the early 1800s who brought this account to the attention of Western Europeaners. He was from Kentucky. So the alleged discoverer, he was the indisputable forger. So yet another example of people saying these can't possibly be true. And in cases where they sound like they might be true, it turns out there's something much more nefarious going on. But we're going to find out that the new genetic discoveries we discussed last time are casting Native American histories like this one in a dramatically new light. Previously in episode 1, we saw that the world is smaller than we think. As I alluded to, and we're discussing the number of people in the Americas, world population growth has changed dramatically in the last few hundred years. And so you go back just 600 years, there's a lot fewer people, 20-fold fewer people alive then than today. So if you're looking for a spouse, you've got a lot fewer options. So either you marry a relative or you marry someone outside your group. We saw in episode 2 that our family trees are much more connected than we think. If I trace the number of my ancestors, 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, back just 1,000 years, I've got more people in theory on my family tree than there are alive in the entire planet at that time. And that's true for me, for Ken, for anyone. So how do you solve this math problem? You make the branches of the family tree connect. My mother's side, my dad's side must be much more related to each other than we previously thought. This implies then, if you think about that answer globally, that so-called racial or ethnic change must happen more quickly than we think. Episode 3, we talked about the genetics of this and how easy it is and how quickly ethnic change can happen, and much more quickly than we thought. Combined with rates of human reproductive growth, we've seen just how easy it is for one ethnic group to take over another. And they can do this silently without us seeing visibly a tremendous amount of evidence today. In theory, it's possible that most Europeans, Caucasian Europeans, are of recent African descent, based on what we discussed in episodes 3 and 4. We've also seen in episodes 5 and 6 that our family tree is much more shallow than we think. To go from 8 people to nearly 8 billion in the globe today happens in 200 generational steps or less. And if you think about that, okay, we've got to reduce 8 billion branches on the family tree back to 8 in boom, 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 in just 200 steps. You're going to have to start connecting branches much more quickly than you're used to thinking about. We've seen that the answers we're going to get from genetics are not the answers you can get from a $100 test from Ancestry.com or Family Tree DNA or 23andMe or any of these commercial genetic testing companies. They're looking at DNA that's inherited from both parents. That can tell you probably a little more than what you already know from your own family tree. So $100 out the door for not much more information. The key information we need is DNA that's inherited from only one parent or only the other parent, so that the genetic signal cannot get diluted. In theory, that could either be the mitochondrial DNA, that's a fancy term for the DNA that mothers pass on, or what we've seen, it could be the paternal DNA, the Y chromosome, the fancy term for the DNA inherited from dads. And we've seen for technical reasons that we discussed in episodes 5 and 6, it's the male inherited DNA that's the best tool for digging into the details, the precise details of human history. And the principle is, this DNA is passed on from fathers to sons, but it's passed on imperfectly. Every generation, a few mistakes are introduced in the DNA sequence. We can identify those just by comparing DNA sequences to one another. We're all so similar at the genetic level, it's easy to spot these mistakes just by the differences. And so these differences then act like ticks of a clock. Every time a new set of mistakes are introduced, it's ticks of the clock. And so we can then compare people around the globe, see how similar or different we are. That represents the ticks of the clock that have passed since we shared a common ancestor. And then we can rederive a global family tree. So if Ken and I get our Y chromosome sequence, and we have very few Y chromosome differences between us, very few ticks of the clock, we must have had a recent common male ancestor. Or if he and I have many Y chromosome differences between us, we must have had a more distant common Y chromosome ancestor. Episode 7, we began to look at the details of this family tree based on the Y chromosome. We saw lost relatives of Europe in India, of all places, in Central Asia and the Middle East. And we saw in episode 8 that the explanation for this likely has to do with the Mongol invasion in the 1200s, their occupation in Europe until the 1500s, the Russian expansion westward, pushing some of them back out, and the Mughal Empire, which is of Mongol descent, coming down into India before the British arrived with the East India Company and the Raj in the 1800s. The East India Company arriving in the 1600s. We've also seen that there's an ancient Chinese connection to modern Europe. Even though China is a long-standing isolated civilization, it's historically had continuous harassment from the so-called barbarians in the north. They were ruling parts of China on and off throughout Chinese history. And some of those northern tribes have also mingled with Europeans, leading to this connection that genetics uncovers. We also looked at the history of the Americas after Columbus, the arrival of the Europeans, to see who settled it, looking for the hidden history of the Americas, which is by extension the history of Western Europe, since about 80% of the US at least was settled by Western Europeans. We've seen that the ancestors of most Americans are not who we think they are. They're Central Asians. Western Europeans and the majority of US citizens, 70% being Caucasian Western European descent, these have Central Asian ancestry as well. In episode 11, we saw that there's been a revolution in mainstream science, mainstream archaeology, and in our understanding of pre-Columbian history. There's been far more people here on the eve of Columbus's arrival than we've been taught. And these people were far more advanced than we thought, not some primitive brutes walking around. In the words of Charles Mann, who authored 1491, he called them survivors of a recently shattered culture, like walking into Nazi Germany after World War II in a concentration camp and seeing all these starving, naked people. If you didn't know the history, you might say, oh, these are leftovers from the Stone Age. No, they're tragic survivors of this awful catastrophe that the Nazis perpetrated on them. Similar thing is going on in the Americas. Now that we're uncovering some of the evidence archaeologically and historically for the massive numbers of people, this rewrites how we understand it. And shocking implications for how we understand the Amazon. There's increasing evidence, maybe 10, 25% of the Amazon is actually cultivated forest, orchard, deliberately put there by pre-Columbian peoples, not this pristine wilderness that's been untouched by mankind for thousands of years. We've seen from genetics that the Americas were resettled at least once before Columbus arrived by the Central Asian invaders. We now want to look at the neglected pre-Columbian history of the Americas. And to begin, I want to highlight how even in mainstream science, attitudes are shifting. Let's think about the Osage tribe. They're, based on their language, classified in the same group as the Sioux, the famous peoples of the northern plains that the U.S. Army engaged as the U.S. pushed westward. We talked about Custer's Last Stand, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, and their Sioux and Cheyenne company fighting against him. Well, Osage are part of the Siouan group. Today, they're found based in Oklahoma. There's a PhD anthropologist, Dr. Andrea Hunter, who's part of the Osage Nation. I've given the URL here at the bottom of the screen so you can see the rest of this discussion. She wrote an article called Oral Tradition and Historical Evidence. And in it, she discusses changing attitudes. So this is a mainstream anthropology individual talking about how even attitudes, using her own nation, the Osage Nation, as an example, attitudes towards Native American oral histories are changing. So she said it's told, meaning Native Americans, the Osage, say that in the distant past, all 5, and I'm not going to say the name because I'm going to butcher it, Osage tribes were once one nation that lived east of the Mississippi River in the vicinity of the Ohio River. Scholars have long contemplated the history and identity of the Osage beginning as early as the 1920s. And the article goes on to show that traditionally, those oral histories were discounted and rejected. Why should we even consider it? And she traces how these attitudes have changed, and people have challenged one another in mainstream science, saying, look, you can criticize it all you want, but until you come up with a better explanation, perhaps we should take what they say as a good starting point. And how even today, mainstream archaeologists are basically in large agreement with the oral history that the Osage tribes have described. So there's changing attitudes here, just like we saw changing attitudes in mainstream archaeology for all of the Americas. This, of course, has its limits, and I want to focus on one particular narrative that I mentioned earlier as an example of the limits and now new discoveries that are emerging in sources of Native American history we've previously discounted. So again, this Delaware tribe, found on the East Coast when Europeans arrived, has claimed to have this red record, this Wallam Olam. Now, because of this PhD thesis from 1995, the Delaware Nation has rejected this as authentic. So the timeline here is McCutcheon publishes this work, the translation of it, in 1993. He's within the mainstream, so he tries to stretch it out over 15,000 or whatever the time scale was at the time for Native Americans. He's not by no means a young Earth creationist, but largely treats it as perhaps an authentic account of their crossing of the Bering Strait and migrating through North America, eventually arriving on the East Coast. And we'll talk about some of the details in a moment. Oestreicher in 1995 was offended by this, and he talks about the background to why he pursued his PhD topic, and ends up concluding that everyone's been misinterpreting this for years, that the red record was fake, invented by some guy in Kentucky to gain himself wealth and fame. We'll return to Oestreicher's criticisms momentarily. What I want to do for the moment, though, is walk through some of the highlights from this account. We don't have time to go through the whole thing. You can buy this on Amazon to see the whole thing. It's composed of 5 individual books, each many stanzas. What I want our viewers to see is how this record reads. I'm, of course, going to read the English translation of it, just to see that this is rather different, perhaps, than many of the fantastical and supernatural sounding accounts. What's also very interesting, especially to creationists, is that how this begins. So let's start with book 1, the opening lines of this red record, and we'll return to some of the mainstream criticisms of this to see what this reveals about the authenticity of this and other records, and the nature of evolutionary criticisms of Native American accounts. So this book begins with, at the beginning, the sea everywhere covered the earth. Above it extended a swirling cloud, and within it the Great Spirit moved. Primordial, everlasting, invisible, omnipresent, the Great Spirit moved. And if you've read the Bible, you might say this sounds a lot like Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. And indeed, this book, this red record describes a very clear creation account, bringing forth the sky, the earth, the clouds, the heavens, bringing forth the day, the night, the stars, bringing forth all of these to move in harmony. So you have echoes here of Genesis chapter 1. Again, the Great Spirit created, the creator, spirits, living beings, immortals, the souls for everything. Those ancestors, the first men were alone, the first women were brought to them. So you hear echoes of Genesis 1 and 2, the creation of mankind. But then, very secretly at the end, an evil snake, a sorcerer, came to earth. Wickedness, wrongfulness, criminal acts, these came there. So not only do you have what sounds like a very strong echo of Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, but other elements of Genesis 1, elements of Genesis 2, and now a fall account, complete with a snake involved, the mighty serpent resolving that men and living things be destroyed. So the mighty serpent, that now is beginning book 2. I've been skipping sections here just for sake of time, giving you the highlights. Brought the snakes, brought the sea monsters, brought the snaking flood, flooding and flooding, filling and filling, smashing and smashing, drowning and drowning. They have a flood account. They have a creation, fall, flood sequence. In this case, the flood is brought about not by God, but by this evil snake. So there's differences, obviously. It's not a verbatim quote from the scriptures. But there's echoes here of that heritage. The great flood dried, valley and hollow. The great peril was over. It was over. After the flood, the Lenape, the true men, and now we're in book 3, the turtle people, were crowded together, living there in cave shelters. Well, what does cave remind you of? Their home was icy. Their home was snowy. Their home was windy. Their home was freezing. Ice Age. Now this is, supposedly if it was forged, this is early 1800 stuff. And here we're talking about Ice Age. I'll give away that I don't think this is forged for reasons we'll discuss momentarily, but notice that they're even discussing not just creation, fall, flood, but Ice Age afterwards, living in caves. It goes on, in the old land, the winter land, the turtle land, the great land where the turtle men, the Lenape. All the enemy snake lodge fires were troubled. The snake priest said to them all, let us go. Now in this case, they seem to be using the term snake to refer to their enemies, enemy peoples. And we'll see this as we go on. They continue to speak of them that way. The snakes there in the east all went forth, going away, grim and grieving. So at this point, and even McCutcheon, the guy who's translating this, agrees, they seem to be describing something happening in Asia, perhaps Siberia. Fleeing, tired and shivering, through the wasteland, torn and broken, to Akomen, the wilderness. So they're describing here these peoples in Central Asia, their enemies apparently, going to Aquaman, which we'll discover is the Americas. They go first, these snake people, whereas the Lenape, the Delaware, stick around for a while, apparently in Central Asia or Siberia, wherever this is. The freemen, carefree and fearless, all went northward, spreading across the snowy country. By the Dark Fish Sea, the Gaping Hollow Sea, settled the White Eagle clan and the White Wolf clan. This appears to be close to the Bering Strait, rowing, crossing the water, for they long gloried in the eastern light, the land of Aquaman. 10 times 1,000 they crossed, all went forth in a night. So about 10,000 people they're crossing. And I want viewers to see the level of detail here that this account gives, even the numbers of people crossing. They crossed to Aquaman, the east land, crossing, marching everyone together. This is now the beginning of book 4. And again, I've skipped a lot just for sake of time. This is a fairly extensive record. Long ago, the ancient Lenape came to the evergreen land. The White Eagle had been the pathmaker hitherto for all of them there. When Aquaman, the ruddy land, the good land, they discovered. The kindred, the hunters, the pioneers meeting in council all declared, Coloweel, noble elder, thou art sachem here. Sachem, you'll see, is just their term for leader, president, something along those lines. Here again are their enemies. The snakes come, thou must slay them. The snake hollow they must leave. Defeated, all the snakes fled to hide in the swampy vales. After Coloweel, in the evergreen land, the sachem was the white owl. After him, the sachem was constantly on guard. And if you've read much of the history of the American West and the Indian Wars, and the names that the tribes would give to one another, you can see the sense of humor they had, their creativity. You look at some of the Siouan names like Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, Man Afraid of His Horses. Very, again, sense of humor, intriguing names. This description and the naming of these people is consistent with that. Constantly on guard, very descriptive names for who their leaders were. After him, the sachem was Chilele, the snowbird, who spoke of the south, that our people would be able to grow and spread there. Southward went Chilele, eastward went the beaver. And this isn't the only time where whoever the original group was apparently broke up and spread out. I want to draw our attention to another event. This account, once you get to the Americas, they list about 90 to 100 sachems, each of them with a similar formula. The name of the guy with a line or two, or maybe a stanza describing some significant event while he was the ruler. Here's an exception, though. So Iamek was one of the sachems. After Iamek, 10 sachems, and they're never named. Much evil was then south and eastward. Well, what was this evil? Notice who comes after. After them, the sachem was Peaceful One and Akolaki. So it appears that there was some evil, perhaps violent, wicked event that was transpiring, so much so that they didn't even name the people who were involved. And I think it's significant that it's followed by a guy named the Peaceful One. So wartime, I think, is implied at that point. We'll return to that momentarily. The next sachem was History Man, written records he began. So this account, taken at face value, claims to be a document that was written over many, many generations. It appears that the sachem, each sachem keeps adding to the record. I was this sachem, or this was the sachem, and he did this. And then the next generation, this was the sachem, and he did this. And on it goes. The next sachem was Shriveled Man. The next sachem was Drought. There was no rain, no food to gather. Eastward they went to where there was water. And again, this guy, the translator, David McCutcheon, goes through, and we'll get to the map he creates, given the geographic clues in this text of how he thinks was the migration from Alaska down through Canada and then across the Great Plains and over the rivers, eventually reaching the eastern shore. And it describes an arrival at the Atlantic Ocean later on in the book. This is book 5. All the hunters reached the sun's salt sea, once more the ocean. Red Arrow was the sachem at the tidewater. There's another record for the Delaware that they have kept besides this. We're going to treat it as authentic for the moment. They kept wampum records, and the wampum records, so their currency in a sense back then, they kept a record of what they were doing. They claim that they reached the Atlantic in AD 1396. We'll return to that date and the significance of it momentarily. There are also 2 mentions of encounters with what they say are white people. Mistaken was the sachem about what then came. This is a little later on. For at that time, from the dawn sea, the whites first appeared. And McCutcheon suggests that this may be the sighting of some of the Spanish along the Atlantic coast in 1524. So over 100 years after they're arriving at the Atlantic. watching, and then a little bit later, watching closely was the sachem, looking seaward. This is the second encounter. For at that time, from the north and south, the white people came, friendly people in great ships. Who are they? And this is how the red record ends. And McCutcheon associates this with the Dutch in AD 1620, so about 100 years after the Spanish. McCutcheon himself, based on the clues in this, and again, McCutcheon views it as largely historical, not a creationist, traces out what he thinks is a good approximation of the movement of these peoples through North America. I want to draw our attention to three main facts, main highlights from this account that we're going to revisit momentarily. First of all, the date for when they arrived. The red record does not give you an AD, B, C, D sorts of things. What it gives you, as we've seen from some of these highlights, is a very systematic account of this was the sachem, and this is what happened. And then this was the sachem, this was what happened. About 95, 96 of them from the time they arrive in North America, crossing over to Aquaman, as they call it, down to when the whites first arrived. You can estimate the date for that first sachem based on the list of about 96. Well, how can you do that? Remember, they have two mentions of when the whites arrive, and they have the mention of their arrival on the Atlantic shore, which their wampum records put at 1396. Given what McCutcheon estimates about the first whites arriving being about 1524, and then the second one being about 1620, you can use those three dates to then estimate the length of each sachem reign. So you've got a certain sachem for Atlantic, another sachem for whites, another sachem down here for the other whites. And you've got the number of sachems between each of these dates, and so then you can use those numbers and those facts to say, okay, on average, then it seems each sachem rules for what? Well, if you do the math, it turns out to be about 7 to 14 years, which is interesting because in the US, at least, presidents are supposed to rule for 4 to 8 years. This is not something too outlandish, it seems, even by modern standards. So there's a range, and again, this is an ancient account, and so there's uncertainty here. But if you use those numbers, that average length of sachem reign, say, okay, 1620 is when it stops. You go back 95, 96 sachems to the beginning. What's the date then we can estimate? And it's in the range of 280 to 630. I mentioned that there was this section of 10 unnamed sachems when there was much evil, as if there was some sort of violent conflict. Again, using that same sort of math, because they tell you when the sachems lived and who was before and who was after, you can estimate that to be around 80, 300s to 800s. And the last thing I want to point out is this red record implies and talks about peoples who are in the Americas before the Lenape arrived. Now, all this would be irrelevant if the thesis from David Oestreicher is true, and it's indeed false. It's a hoax. And again, he's been so persuasive, the Delaware Nation themselves have rejected this as being an authentic account. Well, what's the basis for this? I've read parts of his thesis. I've also have Rafinesque's writings, Rafinesque being the guy who brings this to European attention, or people of European descent, their attention. What are the main claims that Oestreicher puts forth? The first thing I want to say, and the first thing that made me begin to question what he was saying, was the tone. If you read, and I encourage anyone who's interested in this to do so, you can find it online. If you read Rafinesque's work from the early 1800s, it reads just like other people from the 1800s. It just so happens that back then, many naturalists, scientists took the Bible as a historical document. I wouldn't call them necessarily young earth creationists. Rafinesque himself speculates that maybe the Native Americans were survivors of the flood, so he's clearly not a believer in the global flood. I don't know that he'd signed the AIG Statement of Faith, but he's part of a typical group of people who put some credence in the Bible as a historical document and don't reject it as some sort of mythology, as is common today. So it reads fairly factual and like the genre of people writing in the 1800s. Oestreicher's PhD thesis, in parts, reads like a tabloid. And I hesitate to say this, but it's rather shocking the language he uses, and I have wondered how this passed the PhD thesis committee. But so it goes in academia. Another thing that raised red flags in my mind was his description of the background to this and his reasons for investigating this and investigating the origins of the Wallamolam. He said he had become friends with Herbert C. Kraft, the noted New Jersey archaeologist. And New Jersey, of course, relevant because this is where the Delawares were when Europeans arrived after Columbus. Kraft, the archaeologist, argued that the dates for the migration saga and the Wallam Olam are not supported by the archaeological record, which indicates that the Delaware appear to have evolved in situ, meaning in the New Jersey, Delaware area, in their homeland over thousands of years. So here, Ostreicher says, well, mainstream archaeology, which of course has a history of 15,000 years, it disagrees with this. So how can we accept it as factual? Of course, being a creationist and knowing biblically and scientifically that that time scale is off, I thought, okay, here's how the logic works. If the mainstream time scale disagrees, then the Wallam Olam must be wrong. I know that's reason to question not the authenticity of the Wallam Olam, but the methods of mainstream scientists. And we'll discuss more about the problems with this time scale in future episodes. We've already seen in previous episodes some of the major problems with this. Now he goes on to say, Kraft had not found any petroglyphs in the Northeast which resembled the pictographs in the document. And this is the point I want to camp out on momentarily, because it illustrates, I'd say, probably the leading logical flaw with Ostreicher's argument here and other ones he raises. I'm not going to claim that all the questions he raises have been settled and that there's no questions remaining about the provenance and how it was acquired and these sorts of things. There's questions. But I want to show you that his main arguments fall apart if you look at them closely. So let's first take the Wallam Olam at face value, as it claims to be, and see how we should expect the world to look if it was true. Because this to me is something Ostreicher is unable to do, and this to me is a near universal problem in the mainstream evolutionary community. And I've seen this over and over again when they deal with creationist literature. They are unable to think outside their own evolutionary worldview and say, okay, if creation is true, how should the world look? They just think only in evolutionary terms, and then they make all these straw man arguments, not even bothering to try to figure out what the creationists actually say or what they predict the world to look like, and then reject it out of hand. Severe logical flaws, and I see the same pattern of thinking showing up right here. So if the Wallam Olam is true, how much should the language in the Wallam Olam match modern Wallam Olam? And there's pictographs. McCutcheon, in his 1993 account, shows a whole pictographic story along with written Delaware language and then the English translation of all this. If this has been composed, as the Wallam Olam claims, over hundreds, thousand years in various parts of the country, with the Delawares arriving in the Atlantic in the late 1300s, should the modern Wallam Olam language and pictographs found in New Jersey and such, should they match the Wallam Olam, which purports to be an ancient document? Well, just look at the parallel in English. We can start by thinking about the King James Bible, 1611. Is King James English the same as modern English? No, English has changed. Well, you go back even further, Beowulf, which mainstream folks would say has been dated to about 700, 750 AD. This is a very helpful parallel because this now fits, is close to the estimated time frame in which the Wallam Olam is composed. In fact, I'd say the Wallam Olam appears to go back even further, a few hundred years older. I can't read a word of this. It has no match to modern English. That's not going to lead me to say that Beowulf was a hoax perpetrated by someone in the 1800s because it doesn't match modern English. That would be a major logical flaw, and in fact, no mainstream person agrees with that. The Encyclopedia Britannica calls Beowulf the highest achievement of Old English literature and the earliest European vernacular epic. Languages change. That's a fact of human existence. You can see it in the English language, how dramatically it's gone from something unintelligible to modern English speakers to the language I'm speaking right now. So if you find an old document that doesn't match modern English, it's foolish to say, therefore it must be fraudulent. No, let's consider it in its context. So this claim, well, it doesn't match modern Delaware, it doesn't match the pictographs we see in the East Coast. Why should it? If it's been composed in multiple spots over a 1,000, 1,500 year time frame, it shouldn't match. Just look at the history of the English language. It would be much more reasonable to say this, for all practical purposes, might be the highest achievement of Old Delaware literature and the earliest Delaware vernacular epic. So that's just one of the logical problems I've seen, but I think I highlight this because it applies to other arguments he makes, and it's so typical of the evolutionary approach to anything that disagrees with their mainstream view. They are unable to say and consider each conflicting hypothesis, one that conflicts with their own views, on its own terms. They basically assume evolution to reject it, which is a circular argument that it's false. Again, are there questions about the Wallam Olam? Yes. Do I have the answers to all of them? No. What I want to point out, though, not only are the criticisms of the Wallam Olam on shaky logical grounds, here's something else that's rather fascinating. Go back to these 3 points I want to highlight from this red record. This record seems to imply the Delawares arrived from Central Asia in that time frame that I've shown right here, 8280 to 630. Last episode, we talked about the Y chromosome family tree shown here, the fact that we have modern living Native Americans showing up in the tree right here, the branch that we're calling Q. This is the branch that all mainstream folks look to for the history of the Americas before Columbus. We've seen in episode 12 that we can confirm the known post-Columbian history in the DNA of these people. We can infer population growth and decline. That's a whole long technical discussion we got into in episode 12. See that if you want to review that. We can see that we talk about flatlining being the smoking gun of a population collapse, and it was so massive it has retroactive effects before Columbus, this purple line being 1492. We also said we can see the flatlining and the recovery of the peoples of the Americas in the 18 and 1900s. I've summarized a lot that we discussed in episode 12. So this then is the confirmation of what we know happened post-Columbus. Evolutionists don't see this. They do not see the recovery in the 1900s. So the fact that this is working for known history means we can then use it as a tool to probe the mysteries of pre-Columbian history. And we said that they came over perhaps in the 600s or 800s, and I'm going to give you a range of dates because it depends on where you put Noah in the tree. And I've got it narrowed down to just a small range of positions on the tree. This is one position. The other position bumps those dates back a little bit further. But notice whether it's 200 to 500 or whether it's 600 to 800, both of those match very closely what this red record shows. So before we get on to these next points, here's my challenge to David Ostreicher and others. They want to talk about forgery and how could this guy come up with this? Well, let me ask them a question. How is it possible if we're, and let me actually try to analyze their hypothesis on its own terms. So let's say for the sake of argument, we're going to go with Ostreicher's hypothesis that this is a forgery concocted in the early 1800s. What's the chance, if that's true, that Rafinesque, the guy, supposedly the forger, concocts a hypothesis, concocts this account of the Delaware origins in the early 1800s that just so happens to match very closely what modern genetic discoveries will uncover over a century later? That coincidence stretches and boggles plausibility. To me, the much more plausible hypothesis is that this is perhaps a long-standing oral history that got written down recently, or is in fact a long-standing written history. To me, it suggests this is authentic in many respects, not that not all the problems have been solved. This appears to be an actual account that they kept because it matches modern genetics. Here's the other point I want to bring up, another point I want to bring up. They say there was this violent conflict. After Iamek the sachem, there was 10 sachem, much evil. There's the dates there, 300s to 800s. Back to the tree and the two different positions of Noah. They come over 600 to 800. Then they undergo massive population growth in the 800s to 1,000, or 500s to 700s. So this line shooting upward shows the population growing very quickly. The other point I want to highlight here that I didn't highlight in episode 12, this is also the time period, if you look at this tree and other studies, when they're spreading out through the Americas. This is where a bunch of different spots of peoples in the Americas come together. So they're migrating and distributing and perhaps wiping out the people that were here already. So this correlation also seems to fit. This fits the genetic discoveries and the implications of it. So here's a second point of correlation. And then lastly, this record implies that there are people here before the arrival of the Delawares. And I mentioned episode 12. From archaeology, we have Olmecs going back to the pre-1000 BC era. Mayans have archaeology that goes back to the BC times. Yet this genetic discovery from episode 12 implies that these people came over in the AD era. So whoever was here first, their archaeology from the BC era, those are the first peoples. These guys came over, they're the second ones. In other words, genetics and archaeology combined to say there were people here first before today's Native Americans. The red record seems to say the same thing. So again, my challenge to Ostreicher and others is, if what you're saying is true, how is it possible that a guy would fake a document that just so happens to match modern genetic discoveries on multiple points? How could he anticipate this level of detail when genetics wasn't even the field of science back in the early 1800s? And you can read more about this in papers I've just published. I'm arguing that these genetics highlight several points of agreement. They highlight several conclusions reached in this red record account that seem to match modern genetic discoveries. Genetics seems to indicate that this previously rejected source of information, one that the Delaware Nation was convinced to reject as authentic, may in fact be an authentic account of the Delaware history and migration. And if this is true for this one, that's got a long-standing history, how many other Native American accounts, oral or written, are out there that still hold clues to what happened in the Americas before Columbus? How much more is out there standing right in front of our noses that we've previously neglected, rejected as mythological, ahistorical? How much is out there waiting to be tapped and investigated to uncover the real history of the Americas before Columbus arrived? This is the new history of the human race. And we'll be discussing more of this in episode 14.
You know, Nathaniel, I was just thinking as you're doing that, there's a basic problem that people have today, and they've had in regard to those documents you're talking about, because even in the COVID-19 situation, we're hearing certain politicians out there saying Christians are against science and you need to listen to the scientists and so on. And yet, I think it's that people have this misunderstanding that, oh, if somebody goes out there and says in archaeology, this goes back to this date and all the rest of it, this therefore conflicts with this record, they don't realize those people are interpreting those archaeological finds, and it's based on a particular worldview and maybe using some possible dating methods, carbon dating or something like that. It could be some other dating method they use, but they're based on fallible assumptions that can be shown to not be 100% true, and so that can be reinterpreted. I mean, the same sort of thing with modeling for what's happening with viruses and so on. People need to understand their assumptions behind it. There's a basic problem here in that we need to understand the difference between observational science and historical science, as we have always pointed out in this ministry. And that has great bearing on this topic, doesn't it?
And another problem I think is sadly highlighted by that same COVID discussion is something that I hoped had been restricted to Europe, because I'm of German descent, been to Germany many times, and I've heard from people over there back when I've done visits. Experts, got to trust the experts, as if there's a group of people out there who have no biases, interpret things without any hint of preconceived notions, do only the facts, don't bring any assumptions to the table, and somehow we should just trust every word they say. And as if experts never disagree with one another. And of course, and sadly, this is now the attitude I'm seeing over and over again in this pandemic discussion. Well, trust what the experts say. Well, which experts? No one wants to think for themselves. I'm talking to a friend of mine, and he pointed out, others have said, it seems sadly today, many Americans don't want to think about the questions for themselves. They want to be told what to think. And that has dangerous consequences, especially on questions of life and death. And it shows up in these discussions as well. They don't understand observational versus historical science. They don't understand the logic that's used. They don't understand the basic logical flaws in many of these arguments, where mainstream science is so ingrained in this evolution-only view, they can't step outside of it and consider alternatives, because, well, we know it must be wrong because evolution is true. Well, that's a circular argument. If your position is scientifically valid, you should have no problem stepping outside of it and saying, well, here's this other view, but here's why it's wrong. Boom, boom, boom. Here's the 6 points of reason why it's wrong. They can't do that, which to me underscores the deficiencies in the mainstream view and is ample reason to question it.
You know, this also applies to one other area that you brought up in looking at those records and records of what those people had said about their history, and you saw similarities to the biblical account in Genesis. Now, there are cultures all around the world that have flood accounts, that have accounts that sound like the Tower of Babel. I mean, the Australian Aboriginal people, I remember collecting books in Australia from the museums with their Dreamtime legends, and there were accounts about 3 sons on a raft that landed on a mountain after a big flood, and God put a rainbow in the sky. The woman was made while man was asleep. Woman took some sweet honey from the tree, and so therefore, taking that sweet honey, it released evil into the world. Yet the evolutionists would claim that has nothing to do with true history or biblical history. The fact that the elements are all the same, if anything, what they say is, oh, you know, the Jews borrowed their stories, for instance, from the Babylonians, and that's why they have these similar stories, instead of saying there was the original account, and now we see perversions of it all over the world in different cultures. And so because of the evolutionary worldview, they totally misinterpret those things.
And that's to me where the bias shows up so strongly. Osterreicher rakes Rafinesque over the coals, and it's highly suspicious to me. And what seems to be more at play here is it's not that Rafinesque is somehow, he is a product of his time, Rafinesque, the guy who's supposedly the forger of this document. But he sounds just like the other people of that time. And to me, what comes through more clearly in Osterreicher's thesis is the bias people have against the attitudes of that day. It's very difficult for mainstream evolutionists to accept the fact that no, treating the Bible, even if it's not in a young earth sense, but treating the Bible as a historical document and as a guide for academic research was a mainstream good academic view back in the 1800s. And somehow that's just unthinkable to them. And so, of course, it must be wrong. No, no, no. They don't understand that that's modern bias creeping in and trying to judge these older views by a ridiculous modern standard. People like Rafinesque, who was quirky for sure, but quite brilliant. He and others of his day, again, they're living in an era where the Bible is treated as a legitimate document. They've got weird ideas about it. And it's the modern mind that is unwilling to consider the possibility that smart people actually did that back then, and that intelligent people still do that today. That's to me what comes through loud and clear, and sadly is so pervasive in today's mainstream evolutionary community, and it inhibits real progress on scientific and, as we're seeing, historical questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jeanson, and we look forward to coming back for part 14, which will be on the Mayans. And that's going to be very interesting to see what happened to the Mayans. And you're going to give us some answers. So people, come back tomorrow night and go to Answers in Genesis YouTube channel to see all of these programs in a playlist, or subscribe to answers.tv and you'll have it all there, easy to find, along with all of our other hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of video items as well. Thanks, Dr. Jeanson. We look forward to part 14 coming up tomorrow night.
Thank you.